I want you to notice something about your decision making. Many, if not most, of your decisions are aimed at keeping you alive and helping you reproduce. This is true for simple daily decisions, choosing to drink water or eat or look both ways before crossing the street. It's also true for more complex decisions. Who should I marry? What's the best time for me to have kids? How can I teach my children to thrive in our cultural setting? So many of your decisions are geared towards increasing your probability of getting your genes into the next generation and keeping them alive in it. Human behavior varies a lot. People in different contexts behave very differently. And there's a research discipline called human behavioral ecology that says one of the reasons different people and different groups of people act differently is because fundamentally their environments bring different good decisions out of them. Basically, humans evolved a variety of mechanisms that allow them to be behaviorally flexible in response to challenges, and this flexibility is oriented towards optimizing survival and reproduction. This discipline sees groups of humans behaving in certain ways and, at least at first, will try to give them some Darwinian credit and say, well, how does that behavior help them survive and reproduce optimally, given their context? Today's episode isn't aimed at children for reasons outlined in the show description, so families, feel free to make a judgment call on whether to listen to this episode. Today we'll be focusing on an indigenous people known as the Himba that have romantic practices quite different from most of us listening in the West. They're polygynous, men marry multiple women, and everybody has extramarital affairs. Almost all of them, men and women, cheat. Men in this culture knowingly raise the children of the men who their wife has had affairs with. Women help their husbands pick out girlfriends. A full 70% of couples in this society are raising children born of affairs. Both sexes feel jealousy, and yet both in this group deliberately resist these feelings. And today I was lucky enough to speak to a human behavioral ecologist who can help explain why these behaviors make sense. Dr. Brooke Scelza is a professor at UCLA who studies humans as a behavioral ecologist. She starts with predictions based on the assumption that human decisions are typically good from a Darwinian perspective, and then tests those predictions. Her research angle is subtly different from the ev-psych perspective I've grown used to. And it's been a powerful and fruitful approach for Scelza, who, by my lights, is doing some of the most interesting anthropology on Earth. She has made progress on multiple topics under the umbrella of reproductive decision-making, including understanding parenting, cooperative breeding, and, as we'll focus on today, mating outside of marriage. I loved this conversation. I learned a lot. I hope you all do as well. Enjoy. So today I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions about infidelity, but I feel the need to contextualize it in terms of your work before we begin. Most of the research that I've read from you is done on the Himba pastoralists. I hope I'm pronouncing Himba correctly. And I don't think this is a culture many of my listeners will be familiar with. So would you mind just unpacking who these people are?
Sure. So Himba are semi-nomadic pastoralists, and they live in northern Namibia and Angola mostly today. So they continue to get most of their calories still through pastoral production. They also have gardens, but things like education and healthcare are obviously on the rise. Almost everybody has a cell phone these days, things like that. So even though there's no running water, no electricity, in the community. Everybody's got a cell phone and a little solar panel and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting amalgamation of traditional practices and more modern technology.
Wow.
They're a particularly interesting group of pastoralists for a couple of reasons. So we're part of the migration of Bantu throughout Africa, down throughout sub-Saharan Africa. They have some interesting kind of elements to their social structure that I think are going to be particularly interesting when we think about things like infidelity. And the main one of those is that they practice something called double descent. So typically, cultures are either what we call patrilineal or more rarely matrilineal. And that means that things like the inheritance of wealth and like the way that we think about kinship passing happens through either the paternal line or the maternal line. And Himba practice double descent, which means that they have elements of both of these in their social structure. So cattle wealth, right, because they're pastoralists, so they have cows and sheep and goats. Cattle wealth is passed on primarily through men in the maternal line, so uncle to nephew, mother's brother to sister's son. And this is incredibly rare, and it's rare particularly among pastoralists. So typically when these Bantu populations, there was matrilineality early on, and there was some flipping back and forth, but typically when you get cows, this kind of inherited wealth, as opposed to something like horticulture, you tend to switch over to becoming patrilineal and pass that wealth down father to son. And the fact that Himba don't do this turns out to be really interesting when we think about things like paternity, systems of multiple partnerships and things like that. So that's one interesting element about them.
Do we have a causal picture of why double descent happens in this population?
So one theory about double descent is that it's actually sort of a state of what we call disequilibrium. So the idea is that maybe they're in the process of actually flipping from matrilineal to patrilineal. And we have some evidence that that may actually be the case. So we've asked people about their preferences about inheritance and things like that, and people are increasingly seem to have preferences for patrilineal inheritance. And as you get more influx of the cash economy, things are going to change, because if you've got cash in your pocket, right? If you sell your cows and you have cash, those same rules aren't necessarily going to apply about what you have to do with that cash and who you can give it to. So as you start to see more market integration, my guess is that they're going to continue to sort of progress toward a system of more patrilineal inheritance.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I guess we'll get on to the specific facet or peculiarity, perhaps, of the Himba that I find so interesting. So in most Western samples, the average extra pair paternity rate, or the cuckoldry rate, is 1% to 2%. So that means that for most of the people listening to this podcast, there's about a 1 in 100, maybe 1 in 50 chance that the guy you think is your dad is not your dad, and you're actually the child of someone who your mom had an affair with. But when you checked these rates, you and your colleagues in the Himba, you found a really, really high extra pair paternity rate. I think it was 48%. What's going on there?
Yeah. So when I first started working with Himba, this was not even on my radar as something that I was interested in studying. But when I first started interviewing women, I was doing marital and reproductive histories, because I was interested in general dynamics, family dynamics, and things like that. And one of the first women that I interviewed, she listed her kids and we were aging them, and she'd been married twice. And so I was just trying to figure out which kids matched with which husband. And what she told me was, well, these kids are from the first husband and these kids are from the second husband. And then she said these other kids are, and they've used a variety of different terms for this, but omoka, which literally translates to like you get your water from someplace else. And it turned out that those couple of kids, what she was pointing out was that the biological father of those kids was somebody other than the husband. And so I started in those reproductive histories then asking women to also identify who they thought was the biological father. And they have a very strong sense of the difference between social and biological paternity.
It's not like it is in Western society where the children of affairs, let's call them, I don't know if there's a better term that's more cross-culturally applicable, but the children of affairs are generally pitched to everybody as the biological offspring of the husband or the boyfriend or whoever is like ostensibly part of the monogamous pair bond. That's different in the Himba. They're open about the fact that like, hey, this is not my husband's kid.
So they're very generally open about the idea that married people have multiple partners. That's extremely common. We've asked people, do you think your spouse has other partners? And most people say yes. So that, on that sort of general cultural level, there's broad awareness and broad acceptance of that practice for both men and women. So normally, cross-culturally, if it's going to be accepted, it's much more likely to be accepted among men than women.
How common is infidelity then in this group? Is everybody engaging in infidelity?
Okay, yeah, so good question. So it's, I would say, almost ubiquitous. Okay. Especially when you take it at the sort of lifetime perspective, right? So every once in a while you will certainly meet couples where one or both will say, no, my spouse is my only partner. And at that point in time, that's true. You might go back 2 years later and you might get a different answer. So we get these data longitudinally. But for the most part, people tend to have, and this goes, from menarche beyond menopause, people tend to have multiple partners, a formal partner and then one or more informal partners. So this is not a rare event. This is basically seen as something that everybody does. And you would be kind of the exception to the rule if you didn't have more than one partner.
So how is jealousy not just destroying the social fabric of this group? Like I'm thinking about kind of the people I know in my culture, and I just can't imagine people being even slightly tolerant of the idea that their spouse or even their boyfriend or girlfriend has people on the side. How are they insulating themselves from jealousy and violence and shouting matches and all the things that usually come along with affairs in the West?
Yes, that's a good question. So this was one of the things that I was really interested in when people first started to talk to me about this, because they were really presenting this as a social norm. And I asked them, well, don't you feel jealous? And men, I remember talking to some men and they would say, sure, I feel jealous, right? So it's not that jealousy doesn't exist, but I've learned and been taught that this is the way that we do things, and basically that they have to kind of suppress it. And that was really intriguing to me, right? Because there was that piece of it, the kind of suppressing the jealousy. And on the other side, there was also this strong belief that you could be in love with more than one person at a time. So I think that also, in a way, helps in that I don't think that people necessarily felt that because their partner had another partner, that was as threatening to their own relationship as we find to be common here in the West.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So your work falls into the human behavioral ecology framework. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. So I'm trying to think about this through that framework where people are making good decisions, good reproductive decisions on average that make sense from a fitness perspective, right? Why, from that framework, would men be involved with women monogamously at all, right? Like, why would you provision resources to a woman who is raising some other guy's kids half the time And why would you help her raise kids that aren't yours? Like, why would that become the norm? I feel like just in my head, and I guess maybe I'm being wrongheaded about this, I'm just imagining that this degree of female infidelity would lead to the optimum male strategy being just purely focusing on expanding the number of mates and not investing in any of them. I don't know if that's irrational, but how is it logical for males to be involved in parenting if they can't be sure that their kids are theirs?
Right. So this is a really good question. And I think it gets to the heart of what we think about when we think about cuckoldry, right? Because at the heart of cuckoldry is the idea that men are being tricked. So they don't know that they're raising somebody else's kids. And then that the investment that they are putting into those kids who are not their biological children is wasted, right? I would push back on both of those points. So one of the interesting things about the paternity data that we have is that we not only show that there is a really high rate of extra-pair paternity, so I think it's like 70% of married couples had at least one child who was fathered by somebody else, but that both men and women were very acutely aware of this, so they were very accurate at detecting these non-paternity events. So if you just think about it as I am, placing investment in this child and there are no sort of returns to that, then it seems like wasted effort, right? That men should either not invest in relationships or children at all, or they should start doing a lot more mate guarding and be a lot more particular about trying to titrate their investment based on their paternity certainty. And what we see here is something quite different. There are very strong norms that if you are the social father of a child, that you should be investing in that child. And the reason for that is that there are benefits that come back to you for doing that. So men will talk about things like, being known as somebody who is a good father and generous toward these children, regardless of whether they're my biological offspring, is something that garners him benefits in other realms, right? So when they're having discussions among men about decision making in the community and things like that, these men will say that they feel that they are garnering more respect because they are known as being generous in this particular domain of paternal investment. So we've tried to kind of pull that apart by looking at different domains of investment and how men titrate in one area versus another and things like that to kind of push back on that a little bit. But I think overwhelmingly the thing that I walk away with is that this idea of social fatherhood is incredibly important. And when you put back into that, kids are doing important labor in the household and things like that. So, and somebody else is also raising your kids is the other element, right? So you're not just being quote unquote cuckolded, right? But you are fathering kids that are being raised by somebody else. And so there's kind of a system of reciprocity going on that seems to work reasonably well because they have these really strong social norms about the expectations of taking care of the kids that are socially yours.
Yeah, that's perfectly coherent. And hearing this, I'm realizing that it feels. Again, I'm coming at this as a Westerner, so I'm going to be really bogged down by my own cultural background in trying to think about these things clearly. But it does sound analogous to our system of stepfatherhood, where a woman will obtain a new mate and he will invest in children who are from a previous relationship. And there are tremendous benefits from that, such as her liking him more, him being viewed socially favorably. Obviously, stepdads are looked upon favorably in Western culture. So, okay, that does make sense. I guess one thing that I'm still thinking about, though, is the jealousy component. So obviously in kind of a parallel discipline to human behavioral ecology, something in evolutionary psychology, something that's talked about so much is just the hard-grained nature of jealousy and the behavioral suite of mate guarding behaviors that come out of this emotion. Do we see Himba males, and I guess Himba women as well? I mean, we should also talk about male infidelity, even though I think what's really peculiar and interesting is the female infidelity. Do we see mate guarding behaviors in the Himba? Do we see like interference patterns where I guess we'll say the social father is trying to ensure that he is also the biological father as much as he can?
Yes. So this is, I think, what's interesting about kind of asking people these questions in a bunch of different ways over time is that the kind of pat answer that you first get when you talk to people about this, about jealousy, is that they will say, no, we're taught that we need to basically be accepting of these concurrent partnerships. And then we started to dig in on this in a couple of different ways. One was just asking for stories of exceptions. Okay, so you're fine with it, but have you ever heard of a story where somebody got upset about their partner being with somebody else? And almost everybody has a story of a time where the husband waited outside the compound and then came in and tried to surprise the wife with the boyfriend and tell him to leave and things like that. So and I remember one interview where I was talking to a woman, and she was telling me about talking about her boyfriend, and she was married, had been married for a long time, and we finished the interview, and I was then driving into town to go and get something, and her husband came up and asked if he could hop in the car and come along. So I said, sure. And as we were pulling out, she runs up to the car and she bangs on the window. And she's telling me, you make sure you bring him home when you come, right? So she didn't want him to get dropped off in town and then disappear for a few days, right? So I think there is really this duality of both the broad social acceptance, and then at the micro level, there's still all sorts of dynamics going on. And you see lots of variation in how accepting men are. So I had one guy sort of famously say to me, Himba are also polygynous, right? So there's both sort of formal concurrency for men that you can have multiple wives, and then this informal concurrency where people have non-marital partners. So this guy had 2 wives, and he said, it's fine if one of my, if I'm with one of my wives and then the other one has her boyfriend come, that's okay. But what I really don't like is when he stays for tea in the morning. So that was his line, right? And so you see lots of variation in this. Like some men are very jealous, and women have to keep their boyfriends very secret for their own safety. In other partnerships, there's a lot more openness and discussion between spouses where men will know the identity of their wives' partners and things like that. And on the flip side, there are cases where women will sort of choose girlfriends for their husband. And I've had some women say, it's better for the husband if he has a girlfriend than if he takes another wife, because if he takes her as a wife, then there are obligations about how resources are going to be split. If she's just the girlfriend, then the resources are not split as evenly.
I don't know if I'm thinking about this wrong, but as someone who's always thought of jealousy and mate guarding as natural phenomenon, naturally evolved parts of the human mind, my kind of picture of this in my head is that we've got these natural inclinations to guard our mates' resources, guard our mates' sexuality, and then it seems like the Himba are kind of fighting a culturally uphill battle to allow for much more sexual flexibility than perhaps is natural in our species. Do you think that that's fair, or have I misread something?
Well, I guess the part I would quibble with is the what's natural for our species piece of it, because I think part of what makes us unique is that we're able to be so flexible in all kinds of different norms, right? So if we were talking about something else like cooperative tendencies, or then I think it wouldn't feel so strange to us to think that there are some groups are much more cooperative than other groups, right? But when we talk about this, we tend to want to put humans in a box where we say, your natural inclination is that you should be jealous. And I'm not going to, I think to some extent that is true, that those same drivers are acting on humans just like they do in other species, right? And so you do see instances of mate guarding. But what's interesting to me as a behavioral ecologist is thinking about the flexibility and why you might see more mate guarding in one circumstance and not another. So, for example, pastoralists, as their sort of way of life, tend to have to really disperse across the landscape. And a lot of times that results in husbands and wives having to be separated for long periods of time. And you can think about there being two kind of possible responses to that. One is that during those periods of separation, you could have cultural norms that do things to help husbands guard their wives while they're away. If you have patrilocal residence, and then you've got the woman living with all of her husband's kin, they may be sort of taking on that mate guarding role for him while he's away. There may be a very strong system of punishment if she were to get caught, which is a deterrent, right? And you do see that in some pastoralist societies for sure. But with Himba, we see something different, right? We see this same spousal separation. So the costs of mate guarding are much higher because you're not around all the time. And they have relaxed a lot of these norms about sexual behavior, and there's sort of it's a different kind of strategy. And I think coming back to what we talked about in the beginning about double descent, I think the elements of this double descent culture and the matrilateral inheritance matter here because they reduce the costs, right? So if most of your wealth is going to your sister's son and not to your son, that's a reduced cost of investment that's built into the system. You also have these strong continual bonds between women and their kin. So women are very well protected by their own natal family and keep those connections across their lifespan. So they spend a lot of time actually residing at their mom's house and things like that. And so these kind of social elements that were carried along with them over hundreds of years have, I think, can help us understand why this strategy seems to work in this place, and a different, maybe more mate guarding centric strategy might work someplace else.
Do you believe that the human mind has natural inclinations towards jealousy and mate guarding that are kind of default settings of the mind? Or do you believe that this flexibility comes from a place where we really can go in a lot of directions and the mind doesn't really start out with any biases in that direction? Because certainly, like in, again, parallel discipline, but certainly in evolutionary psychology, it's almost a dearly held tenet that there are modules in the mind for jealousy. There are these ingrained instinctive feelings, and these feelings lead to instinctive behaviors. I think that it's totally plausible that the true picture here is different, and that this vision of our mind is an illusion created by the culture in which this vision of the mind was produced, Western culture. But I also feel that it's strange that if there aren't such modules, that the Himba would feel that they were fighting against anything. Like you talk about males suppressing their jealousy. You talk about women saying to you, hey, I'm not necessarily the jealous type. And then as soon as you get in the car with their husband, they're all upset. Would you say that there aren't these systems in the mind, or that there are, or is there no binary there?
Yeah, I guess I would say I don't think there's quite as strict a binary in that, yes, I think there are modules in the mind. I'm not sure I would go as far as to say there is a module for jealousy, but I think that some of these underlying principles of paternity certainty and things like that matter. They matter across, they're deep, deep, deep in our evolutionary history, right? And if you have paternal, it makes perfect sense to me that if you have paternal investment, that thinking about paternity and paternity certainty is going to be important. And so, yes, I take a little bit of sort of a middle ground approach in that I do think that they are swimming upstream, as you said, in terms of that inclination toward jealousy may be there and be there for very good reasons, but you can have this sort of social system layered on top of it that's going to act maybe as a buffer. And one of the ways that thought this was really interesting was David Buss has this theory about jealousy and the sex difference in jealousy, where men are predicted to be more upset than women by a sexual infidelity versus an emotional one. And I have to say, I was honestly fairly agnostic when I took this on with Himba, but I was really curious to see if you took this outside of a kind of Western context and ran the same kind of study with Himba, who professed to have much lower levels of jealousy and have a lot more sexual autonomy, whether you would see this. And so I ran this same study that he did with Himba, and we did replicate the sex difference, right? So we did find that that men were more likely than women to be, when given a choice between the two, that the more upsetting type of infidelity was the sexual one. The other interesting finding from that, though, was, so if you look at just within sex, the proportion of who chooses what, right? You can have that sex difference where 90% of men say the sexual infidelity is worse and 10% of women say the sexual infidelity is worse, right? That would be a real extreme. In the US, it's more like half, a little bit more than half of men say the sexual infidelity is worse, and then maybe like a quarter or so of women say the sexual infidelity is worse. So you have a sex difference there in the expected direction. What we found with Himba was that the majority of both men and women said that the sexual infidelity was worse, but just more men than women. So it was like 90-60, right? So you see that same pattern, but it is shifted. And so then I brought together a bunch of anthropologists who were working in all different places, and we ran this jealousy study. And we did find, I think it was 11 places, including the US, but also a variety of different locations around the world. And we did find really consistent evidence of this sex difference. So I do think, right, there's a there in terms of things like that, for sure. But then what we were interested in was, well, what predicts differences in the severity of jealous response? And one of the things that we found was that the level of paternal investment matters. So in societies where fathers are expected to invest more, there was a more severe jealous response. So you see this kind of titration of the jealous feelings and behaviors exactly where you would expect it to occur, right? Because it is potentially much more costly if you have men investing a lot. And that's where I think Himba are in this kind of interesting position, because they are buffered by the fact that the wealth is inherited matrilaterally, and also that child labor is important. So girls especially are doing a lot of work in the household. You really need kids in this kind of economy. So that reduces the sort of net cost of your investment in non-biological children, right? Because you're getting something back, which is not the case in the US, right? Where my kids are not a real net benefit around the house as much as they help set the table or something, right?
Right.
So, I mean, these things matter. And I think, like, what I guess would advocate is that we should try to be open-minded to the full perspective. So there may be these things that really seem to replicate really well across cultures, like this sex difference. And the underlying evolutionary logic for why you would expect that sex difference, I do think makes perfect sense. And then on the other hand, understanding the variation that you see also can fit within an evolutionary perspective, because that variation can be predicted.
Right. One thing that I love about the progress of this conversation is that I've started from a place where the 48% extra pair paternity number just seems completely unfathomable. And then as you walk me through the fact that, mate guarding is more expensive and children are cheaper, and the social benefits to being I guess we'll say stepdad, but I'm sure there's a better term, they're much higher. And so there's kind of this suite of reasons why it's just not that bad for a man to be cheated on as it is in America, where it would mean that you're really investing all of your resources in someone else's kid and getting almost no credit for it, maybe even a little bit of shame. Is there anything else that you can say to kind of clarify this picture for the people listening who are like, how could a social system function so differently to my own?
Yeah, well, I think it really is sort of a perfect storm, right? So my intention in kind of presenting what's going on with Himba is not to say, see, they're all wrong with the way that they think about these things in the West, right? It's not wrong at all. It makes perfect sense to me that the extra pair paternity rate in the US is like 1%, right? Because it matches with exactly this suite of cultural factors. And with Himba, I think you have sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, where you have this kind of perfect storm of factors that all together create an environment where you could have this kind of system thrive. So you've got the matrilineal inheritance, you've got spousal separation, which makes mate guarding more expensive. You've got child labor being important, and you have other options. So you have fosterage. So one of the things that we did is we looked at different domains of men's investment to see if they were titrating differently across different domains of investment. And so, for example, men are expected to pay bride price when their sons get married. So it's typically a couple of cows and a couple of sheep. And we found, and then we asked men, we had their paternity assertions about a bunch of in this case, sons. And so we knew whether they thought that son was theirs or not and how much they paid in bride price. And we found basically no difference in the amount of bride price paid. Now, that's a very social realm of investment, right? Everybody knows this is a public marriage ceremony. The amount that was paid in bride price is, gets out. And if a man were to shirk his duty in that domain of investment, it would have negative consequences for his reputation, potentially. But there were other domains of investment, like small, we asked a vignette about small food transfers, and we looked at anthropometrics. And there we found that even though the norm was very strong, and we asked about this too, that you should treat your kids equally, we found that there were differences in anthropometrics for the kids who were born to the boyfriend versus the husband. But particularly, this was a problem for girls. On the other hand, this gets a little complicated, but boys are more likely to be fostered out if they were from the boyfriend. And again, we think this has to do with child labor. So girls are super helpful in the household. They do a lot. And so if you have a girl from the boyfriend, you're not going to be as likely to foster her out because you need her. But she may get a little bit less food, right? She may not get treated quite as well at mealtime and things like that. Whereas boys, who are not as helpful around the household, they herd goats, but they're not seen as being as helpful as girls. They're more likely to be fostered out. So that there are all these different ways that you can kind of play with the system that reflect these different costs and benefits.
Wow. It's incredible to me how precise and explicable and amenable to just data analysis these behaviors are. Because obviously, everyone listening knows this as a human. When we're making decisions about who we mate with and how much we invest and things like that, we're not doing the math in our heads, right? Like, we're not mulling over the fitness benefits and costs of having a stepchild and not. We just kind of do these things intuitively. Is this how do things like this come about? Is this through unconscious processing in the brain? How do we make such good decisions when we're not even necessarily aware of why we're making them?
Yeah, so some of it, I'm sure, is unconscious. That part of it is much more difficult to measure. But you get people saying even some fairly explicit things. Like people will talk about how their fathers did bias against them because they knew that they were from the boyfriend. On the other hand, you'll get people say, when I was young, my father was not that nice to me, but I worked really hard, and now I'm his favorite child. So again, you can really see the fluidity of these things over time, and there's all sorts of factors that matter in any one individual case, right? So it gets real messy when you get down to the individual level. But when you look at the level of patterns, we're able to see some things that make pretty good sense.
Huh. I guess one thing that I really should have asked about earlier, because I was so bewitched by the jealousy component of this and just imagining this from a male perspective, is obviously the female perspective has kind of gone unexplained here. So I understand now how and why jealousy and mate guarding have been dampened in this society. But why has female infidelity been spiked in such a way? Now, I'm not saying female infidelity isn't cross-culturally common. It is. I think that the Western rates, depending on the studies you consult, it can be 1 in 5 women, or up to 1 in 2 women will have an affair on their spouse at some point. But obviously, this is a higher rate of female infidelity and a much more committed practice. What do women benefit from? How do women benefit from extra pair mates? And why is it that we see so much female infidelity among the Himba?
Yeah, good question. So there are 2 kind of dominant theories in the literature, and then there's a third one that I will advocate for also being a piece of the puzzle. And these are not mutually exclusive. But the first is called dual mating. And so this is the idea that you have kind of a 2-part strategy. So that women are getting investment from one partner, and then they're getting good genes from another. And the evidence for this is quite mixed. It seems to be a lot of the evidence was looking for things like shifts across your menstrual cycle and what your preferences would be, and that evidence seems to be weakening. The second explanation is a kind of mate switching hypothesis. So this is the idea that women might have an advantage if they have their primary partner and then they have either a backup partner or they're kind of feeling around to see if maybe there's another better option out there, and they could then sort of trade up, right?
Can I jump in here with a curiosity question?
Yep.
Do we see that among the Himba? Because I've read your papers on the Himba, and I don't remember if you spoke about women leaving their social husband, let's say, for their love boyfriend. Is that something that happens?
So yes, it happens for sure. Like anecdotally, okay. I can tell you that it happens, and we can trace some of these too, where a woman will have a kid with her first husband, and then the second and third kids from within that marriage are fathered by somebody else, and then that person becomes the second husband. So we do for sure have sort of anecdotal evidence that this is happening. I'm not sure we have a big enough data set yet to be able to look systematically at that, because it happens, but it's not happening like as frequently as just having a child with a boyfriend happens, right? Because a lot of times people will maintain the same boyfriend from menarche past menopause and never marry him. So I think that mate switching is part of the explanation for sure, and as I said, I don't think these are mutually exclusive explanations. But another possibility that I think is also part of what's going on with Himba, and which may be a lot less likely to show up in evolutionary psychology studies, which tend to be dominated by samples that are coming from the West, is what I would call like a multiple investors hypothesis. So the idea that by having concurrent partners, that you're able to get resources from those different partners at different points in time. So sometimes this is framed in a really simplistic way as just sort of a sex for food kind of explanation. I think this is more complicated than that. So what we'll see, for example, so my research partner has done a lot of this work because there's some really great data that he has about partner preferences where we sort of know people's mate value within the community, and then we know specifically whether you're interested, how interested you might be in other people. And we have that along with food security data. So what we found is that women who are more food insecure and have more dependent offspring, so they're in this precarious situation, they are more open to additional partners than women who are more food secure, right? Yes. So that's sort of what you would expect. And then we also find that that in general, women who have both a marital and a non-marital partner have greater food security than women who have only one or the other, so only a boyfriend or only a husband. And again, the spousal separation thing matters here, right? Because if you're separated from your husband for months at a time, especially before cell phones, right? Then having somebody else that you can go to if you need something is going to be important. Now, you can always go to your kin, right? And we don't think that that's not happening here. But this is another potential partner. And people would tell stories, for example, if a child had to go to the hospital, that's going to cost a lot of money. You have to pay for transportation. You have to pay to have someplace to stay while you're there. And so people will sometimes, they'll try and get money from multiple people to kind of accrue the funds that they need for this. And so sometimes the husband definitely seems to be the primary resource partner for women. That's going to be their number one go-to. But it could be supplemented by other people. Family, but also boyfriends and potentially the biological father of that child. So I think that this matters here. And this is something that we've seen in other societies where women have multiple partners too. So it's a part of the kind of partable paternity complex that you see in South American indigenous societies, where again, women are able to sort of garner resources from more than one man at a time. And that's really helpful to them.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot of thoughts on the multiple investors hypothesis. I guess one place where I'm struggling is that the two other hypotheses come from an evolutionary psychology background, which is big on human universality and modularity and inbuilt mechanisms in the mind that are pretty ingrained that cause these behaviors, such as infidelity. Whereas the multiple investors, it comes from the much more flexible and I guess regionally adaptive place of human behavioral ecology. Yeah. Do you think that the multiple investors hypothesis has legs outside of regions such as the Himba, where the costs of having an extra boyfriend are so much lower? Like, what do you make of the dual mating strategy hypothesis, the good genes hypothesis, and the multiple investors hypothesis outside of a Himba context in the wider world?
Yeah. So I do think that the multiple investors hypothesis is going to be particularly prominent in a place like northern Namibia, where people are resource stressed, people are food insecure. But that is indicative of, how we lived for a really long time, where these things would have been consistent pressures, right? We didn't live in calorie surplus, hostess cupcake kind of society for most of our history. So I think that we see evidence of it now, in Himba, because they are still experiencing stochasticity in access to resources and things like that. That doesn't mean you couldn't see it here, right? I think, there are places in the US where you could look and people probably should look, but that's not where most of these evolutionary psychology studies tend to get their data, right? They're not going to, lower SES communities and looking at these issues. And I would advocate strongly that people should be. But when you're looking at college students, it's a different story. So the fact that we haven't found a lot of evidence for this in the West, to me, fits the hypothesis. It doesn't go against it, right? Because we shouldn't expect to see this being a dominant strategy where resources are plentiful and where you don't need multiple partners. So I think that you would find more evidence of something like mate switching, maybe being rising to the surface as being an explanation more in places like this than you would in Namibia. You see it there too. And again, I would strongly say I just don't think that these that we have to choose one of these.
Yeah.
The good genes, I've Marty Hazelton, who was one of the people who has long advocated for the dual mating hypothesis and helped to write some of the fundamental papers on it, is a close colleague of mine, and she has done, I think, really great work trying to test this hypothesis, and I've toyed with the idea of trying to think about how you could reasonably test this in Namibia to really look and see. But it would honestly be an incredibly complicated study if you were trying to get, hormone samples at the right times and then get sexual recall data and things like that. It would be, an interesting dissertation project for somebody, but it's a huge project to take on. And it's really difficult because, of course, even though now Himba are using contraception more and more, women spend a lot of their reproductive lives pregnant or breastfeeding. And so it's a different kind of hormone profile, and chances of getting pregnant and things like that are all going to be really different than they are if you were to do this study in the US, for example. So it's hard to test. And I haven't seen, we did a test about traits that you find desirable in a formal and an informal partner, and we didn't find much evidence for dual mating on that level. But doing the real rigorous kind of testing of a dual mating kind of hypothesis, as far as I know, hasn't really been done outside of a weird context.
Do you have any thoughts towards expanding your multiple investors hypothesis to Western populations and seeing if it's operable there?
Yeah, so, like I said, I certainly think that there are going to be circumstances where you would be more likely to find evidence for the multiple investors hypothesis. And so, I imagine you might see it cropping up more in lower SES communities within the US or something like that, right? So you might want, I think you would, if you were going to do a study like this in the West somewhere, you might want to specifically try to aim for a population where resource scarcity was more prominent, because you might be more likely to find it there. But something like when Bus talks about one of the ideas in this mate switching hypothesis is sort of keeping a backup mate so that you have somebody who can step in if your primary mate leaves you. Right now, I don't know how common that is in the West, right? But I think that it's interesting in that it sort of dovetails with the multiple investors hypothesis,
yes.
Right? Because you can have that, you can be getting those resources from both people, and then also they may be the person who can step in if you were to get divorced or your spouse dies or something like that. So again, I really like to think about all of these things as not as competing hypotheses so much as thinking about elements of them that may be more or less likely in particular settings.
So where are you going next? What's the future directions for the lab, if you have anything that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, I'm still really interested in family dynamics. We still have lots of data that I feel like I want to get out there about partner preferences and thinking about. So we had in this mate preferences paper, we, for example, showed that women tended to want boyfriends who were more generous, whereas they preferred having husbands who were wealthier. And that sort of linked back to what I said earlier about, as a boyfriend, you don't have to give to your girlfriend. So being generous really matters. So you can be really wealthy and really stingy, right? But if you're married to somebody, the wife is sort of owed cows to milk and things like that. So it's harder to be stingy with your wives than it is with a girlfriend. And so, but now we have a whole bunch of this preference data, and we have trait data. And so we're interested in sort of trying to merge all those different pieces together to really look not just at people's preferences, but what are their behaviors, what are their relationship histories actually look like, things like that. So that's sort of where we're heading next with some of this. And then also looking at things like how extra-pair paternity affects reproductive skew. So it seems like what's happening is that these young men who are not old enough to get married yet or old enough to have, multiple wives, things like that, they're like part of the reason that gerontocratic polygynous system works is because these young men do have access to girlfriends while they're young, right? And so they're sort of gaining extra pair paternity when they're young and then losing it as they age. But it seems like it sort of balances out over the lifespan. So I'm interested in sort of looking at that and how that can have sort of a dampening effect on reproductive skew, because instead of having all these men who just don't have any access, right? So you've got all these zeros for, in a cross section of the population. Those men actually are fathering kids. They just don't get this sort of social cachet of having them count as theirs. So if you look at skew biologically versus skew socially, it's going to be a really different picture.
I'm so excited to hear more research from you. Obviously, I'm a massive fan and I've been reading a lot of your work for some time. So it was so cool of you to come on the show and spend some time with me today. I really feel like I learned a lot.
Oh, it was great fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Dr. Scelza for coming on the show. It was a wonderful conversation, and I'll be thinking about it for quite some time. Thank you to all of you for listening, and thank you to all the donors who make this show possible. I can't wait to talk to you all again in just a couple of weeks. Until then, please enjoy what's left of summer, and remember to be kind to animals.